Imagine taking a drug for 15 years and then coming off of it only to wake up a completely different person. Your career, relationships, personality, even your taste in food have all changed. How does this shift your world? And how do you rebuild your life after such a transformation? Stay tuned for my interview with award-winning chef and author Brooke Siem. So, Brooke, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your story. Your life was completely turned upside down by a medication, Effexor, which you were started on when you were 15. I mean, you've covered this in your memoir, May Cause Side Effects, and I really appreciate you coming on to share your story. So if you could just tell us, how did all of this happen?
Well, my life wasn't really turned upside down because of Effexor and Wellbutrin until I decided to get off of them. And so that was part of what was the whole perplexing nature of this. There's a lot of paradoxes in withdrawal and medicating in general, I think. And so when I was first medicated, I was 15. My father had suddenly died within about 6 months after his death. I was put on a combination of Effexor XR and Wellbutrin XL. And there really wasn't any major difference before or after. People ask me that all the time. They kind of say, well, did they help? Did they change anything? And the answer was kind of no. And I have a lot of memory loss around that time, in part because of the trauma of losing my dad. I think also the drugs severely affected my memory. So I'm not the greatest narrator for that period of time. But when I asked my mom about it, she said that she really didn't feel like the drugs made that much of a difference at all. She said I was a little flatter, maybe not as emotionally reactive, but she will say that they made her feel better. And that was the mistake she made, that I was medicated because it made her better, not because it made me better. And then I kind of just never really improved. I wasn't someone who was depressed and then wasn't when I was on the drugs. I was depressed off them and I was still depressed on them and just kind of thought that's who I was. But things really went upside down when 15 years later, I decided to get off the Effexor and the Wellbutrin. And that's really when my life changed.
And what was happening to have you even make that decision to decide, hey, now's the time to come off? I mean, you'd been on the drugs for 15 years. What brought about that decision?
It was kind of an unremarkable moment in some ways. And in hindsight, it's kind of still shocking to me that it didn't dawn on me earlier. I was just still very depressed, and I wasn't suicidal in the sense that I was in an active crisis. And I never felt like there was a crisis around it, but I constantly wanted to die. And I constantly thought about not living and taking my own life, but it never felt like a crisis to me. It never dawned on me to call the suicide hotline. It never dawned on me that maybe the antidepressants weren't working well if that's how I was feeling, because it was so native to me. And it was something that had crept up slowly. And so it was very insidious. So it just felt normal. And so one day, literally, I was around my 30th birthday, it just dawned on me that if these antidepressants were working, I shouldn't be thinking like this. And I just kind of said, well, that's odd. I hadn't thought about that somehow, but the thought stuck in my head. And then I didn't do anything about it right away. But what happened was within a few months, I got this kind of bizarre opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And it just became clear that logistically, I wasn't going to be able to take all of my drugs with me in a suitcase because I was on 4 other drugs to combat the side effects of the antidepressants at the time. So it was just a huge volume of pills and capsules, and I couldn't rely on getting refills where I was going. And so combining that with realizing, okay, maybe this isn't working anymore. I just thought I needed to get off the Effexor and the Wellbutrin and then get on something else. But I figured that was the solution. And I figured that would all be fairly fast and seamless because from my view at that point, I was depressed to a point that was not my fault. It was all chemical imbalance. It had nothing to do with me. I had no control over it. I couldn't fix it. So all I needed was just a different drug. And then I would just go on my way.
Yeah. Looking back on that time now, when you were making the decision to come off the drug or maybe even swap out the drug for something else, how did you understand the cause of your depression? I mean, were you at that time, was it, this is just a chemical imbalance, or looking back on it now, were there other things at play during your 20s that were contributing to you feeling, like you said, periodically you would have suicidal thoughts, and that was just kind of who you were, was the sense. Like, how do you understand that, looking back at that period of time, maybe in the moment and now kind of reflecting back on it now?
Oh, at the time, I was fully in the camp of anything mental illness is just shit luck. There's nothing you can do about it. It's a disease just like any other disease. It never dawned on me that, well, wait, if this was just like any other disease, we should be able to test for it and measure it objectively through blood or scans or anything. The fact that no one had ever given me a medical test and told me I had a disease never dawned on me at the time. I just fully bought into the fact that there was something wrong with my brain and that I had no control over it. And that was just the way it was. And for me, frankly, it was a fantastic excuse not to thrive or do anything with my life. I used it all the time. And I did it unconsciously and also consciously. There was a part of me that knew that I didn't have any expectations or really need to put any pressure on myself or need to try. If I just said, well, I'm depressed, this is just who I am, like, this is the best you're going to get, deal with it. That's kind of how I felt. And I knew I was using it as a tool while also not having any clue that, one, the drugs were affecting my state, and two, that if I could get the drugs out of my system, I could have a whole different life and have a whole different perspective. I really, really did not understand that. It wasn't until I went through withdrawal and started to see the huge change in between. For me, I had windows and waves that would last between hours and days. So in one day, I could have a window and a wave. And just being able to experience that so quickly in real time was wild, because I said, oh my God, I'm viewing the world like two totally different people in a span of 8 hours. What does that mean about everything I know?
And just to sort of bring this to a point, do you think that the medications may have been contributing to your depressed state in any way?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Then this is one of the reasons why I get so frustrated with our current state of mental health, is that depression is just a really bad word to use as a descriptor. It encompasses so many different things. It encompasses so many different feelings, and it's wildly different from one person to the next. So I've had periods in my life over this past year or so where I could absolutely be diagnosed with clinical depression, but I have never at any point, I've been off the drugs for 8 years now, I have never at any point identified as being depressed or having a disease, or that maybe I needed to go back on the drugs. Like, that has never entered my psyche, because now I have the perspective and the fortitude to look at this with true nuance and say, what is this depressed state? What is this constriction trying to tell me about my world, right? And so that when you're medicated, I don't think you have the ability to really kind of wrap your brain around different ways of perceiving, because you're cut off from both the highs and the lows. And so you're really existing in this very limited sphere of experience. And when you've been living in that sphere of experience since you were 15, when you were a child, and then you went through puberty and had your entire late teens and 20s where you're supposed to be developing that experience, when you're supposed to be learning from the world, but you didn't actually get a chance to integrate that because the drugs are only allowing you to experience so much emotionally and spiritually, I think, and physically even too. It means you don't fully learn. And so then in my 30s, when I came off of this, the best way I can describe it, it was like going through puberty a second time. I mean, I literally felt like I was a hormonal teenager who didn't know anything. And so it was just a wild difference. It's so difficult to explain unless you've been in it, but anyone who's been in it in the way that I have completely understands what this experience is like.
Yeah. Let's put a pin in that, because I think that'll be really interesting to get into more later on. But let's discuss your withdrawal experience, though, because that ended up kind of being a big influence for your book. And I know you've told me that you were so angry about what had happened to you. So tell us what happened to you when you came off these medications.
My expectations weren't managed at all by my psychiatrist. I literally had seen her once because I was getting my drugs from a GP for the better part of a decade. And then when I decided to come off of them, I knew my GP wasn't a great doctor. He was like literally just a pill mill. And so I said, all right, I'm going to be smart about this and go see a real psychiatrist, thinking that she would actually have some education around it. And she just didn't. And it was 2016. So I don't fully blame her because this topic wasn't even a conversation in 2016. But she just told me that because at the time I was on 37.5 milligrams of Effexor, which is the lowest dose on the market, she just said that I had to stop cold turkey and that I didn't have a choice. And that was just the way it was going to be. And that I might have the flu for a few days and that was it. And so that's kind of what I thought. And so when the symptoms started coming in really strongly for me very quickly, within about 4 or 5 days, and for me, they were huge psychological symptoms, most intrusive thoughts, violent intrusive thoughts. My senses pretty much all got turned up as high as they could go. So my hearing was really enhanced. My vision completely changed. Things got sharper, more colorful. My skin felt so tender. I felt like I couldn't wear clothes. My taste buds changed. And as a chef, that was a little tricky. But it all happened quite literally within an hour. Like I was just walking on the street in New York, sort of feeling slightly fluish, feeling like I could handle it. And then it just hit me in literally 1 second. All of my perception changed. And then the intrusive thoughts came in. And it was just terrifying because I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know this was a possibility. I thought I was actually crazy. I thought that this was who I was without the drugs. But at the same time, there was something in me that knew I couldn't go back to the psychiatrist and tell her what was going on because I thought she would have put me on an involuntary hold. Because if I told her that I was having such violent thoughts towards myself and other people. And thank God I didn't go back to her. And I know that's exactly what would have happened. And luckily I had a family friend who was a psychologist who I sort of told a little bit what was going on. My mom was like, you need to call her, because I told my mom sort of what was going on, not entirely. And so I called this woman and she was in a different state. And she just pretty much said, I think that this is withdrawal from this drug. It's really powerful. And basically that's what it is. And that, knowing that it was something else and not me, was enough of a push for me to keep going, plus my stubbornness and then anger around everything. Because as horrible as all the violent thoughts were and the oversensitivity, being able to see more color was really kind of monumental to me. I could literally see saturation in color like I'd never seen before, and it was beautiful. And I realized that if these drugs had such an effect on my whole body that I was never really truly seeing the color of a flower, then what else had they affected? And that was what was motivation for me. I was pissed off. I was pissed off that someone had taken color from me. I didn't even know what else had been taken from me at that point, but I knew color had been taken from me. And when I realized that, I was like, I will never go back on these drugs again. And I just didn't know how long it was going to last. So I had the gift of ignorance on my side.
So, on this channel, we talk to a lot of people who have had protracted withdrawal before, and we see people ranging from those who are like bedbound for like 5 years to some people who, they're pretty sick for like 18 months, 2 years, and then things kind of slowly come back. Can you give me a sense of like what happened to you? Like how debilitating was your withdrawal? How long did it last? Like how long were you in that state of just feeling like you were insane?
Yeah. I grew up, I was a very, very serious ballet dancer. And because of that, I had basically been trained since I was a young girl to smile through the pain. And that even if your feet were bloody and your point shoes were filling up with blood, the audience didn't care and your instructors didn't care. And you better look like an ethereal fairy every single day and keep it quiet about whatever you were going through. I think that training in some ways was probably both beneficial and maybe detrimental. In a lot of ways, it's been detrimental in my life. But in this case, it basically, I was so used to being in varieties of pain that I just kept pushing through in withdrawal. So I kept working to the extent that I could. Sometimes if I could work from home instead, I would, but I sort of lost all sense of shame. Like I was living in New York City and I owned a bakery, and I would just be sobbing or having these huge emotional swings, or my body just hurt, and I just didn't care. I was like, I don't have a choice. I can't stay home. So I would just be a puffy, emotional mess at my bakery, and the customers would come in, and my response was basically like, deal with it. Do you want a cupcake or not? Right. It wasn't very perky.
Yeah.
And so I really didn't tell anyone what was happening. My mom knew. And when I could simply isolate, I would. But I just had to push through. I was lucky in the sense that my physical side effects were not so severe that I was bedbound or hospitalized. My mental and emotional effects, I think, were probably about as close to as bad as, well, they're at least as bad as they've ever been in my entire life. I think probably most people would say it would be as bad as it could get. But I was an only child growing up. I was used to kind of being alone with my thoughts and feelings. And so I just isolated. That was my strategy.
Mm-hmm. And when do you think you truly came out of you truly recovered from the withdrawal effects of Effexor?
So I got off the Effexor in March, and then I got off the Wellbutrin in July. And then I say it was about 2 years before I felt like my issues in my life were not because of withdrawal. And I don't remember the day specifically. I know it was sometime in 2018. So it would have been about 2 years. And I just remember thinking, like, I haven't thought about this in a really long time. And that was kind of the day that I just decided I was done, that whatever happened or remained in my life was not because I was still in withdrawal. It was, there's some lingering effects from it, but it's not like a chemical reaction anymore. The severe withdrawal for me took about a year, and then another year of kind of, in and out, touch and go, seeing progress, but maybe not fully knowing, like believing that it was going to stick. And then I just realized maybe a couple weeks had gone by and it had never entered my brain that was going on. And I was like, oh, I think I'm done.
Yeah. And what I'll say with that is, having worked with a lot of people with these withdrawal related problems, that's quite a normal timeline. Yeah. I'd say that's the majority of people that come to me. I think within 1 to 2 years, they're out of the worst. They're out of the worst of it. Yes, they may still have some residual symptoms, but it's the intensity dies down. And I think people miss this because if you go online, you hear a lot of really serious stories where people are sick for multiple years. Yeah, they are the outliers. You are the norm, and that's what I see from people walking through my door.
I see that too. Actually, I see that too, Dr. Joseph. Like I think 2 years is about the mark. I've thought about this recently. I was working with someone, and I'm usually when I'm working with people one-on-one, I'm usually very reticent to give them any sort of timeline, including my own. Like they can find it, because people, when you're in pain, you can really hold on to it. And some people are going to say, oh, I can handle it for a year. And other people are going to say, I can't. So I try and stay away from timelines, but I've also wondered why it seems common that 1 to 2 years, like even more like 18 months to 2 years is pretty standard for when people say they're through it. And what I think is going on is that that's enough time to experience the breadth of life. I think 2 years is enough time where something real bad's going to happen in that 2 years that you have to deal with. You need more than just a couple weeks or a couple months to get used to the ebbs and flows of withdrawal and how it affects you in your life. You also need about 2 years to look at your situation and say, what here is not working for me anymore, and to change that. And you're doing all of this while you also are having this chemical interference, if you will. So I think it's kind of like when they say you shouldn't marry anyone unless you've been dating them for, a year or two. It's like you need that amount of time in order for enough of life to happen to you that you can handle it, and you start to change your life to have it reflect who you actually are without the drugs. That's why I think it takes that amount of time.
And it's multifactorial, and I think you are getting, and you really get into that because, one, I think there's multiple things at play. Yes, your brain is healing. There's neurogenesis. The neurons are turning over because your body knows that things are haywire and it's sending signals to repair the damage. But also there's like grieving as well. It's like people, you go through the stages. It's like, what the hell has happened to me? And I've been hurt. This is impacting me and my relationships and my world. Yeah, I've hurt people. Now I need to kind of rebuild my life. I think a certain amount of anxiety about the injury will abate over time as your life as your new life takes place. And so that will reduce the stress, the intensity of the symptoms go down. So there's all of these things kind of happening that, that balance people out. Yeah. So let's talk about this, Brooke, because you were, and we were talking about this before. You're on this drug for the formative period of your life. I mean, your late adolescence through your 20s, you're coming off in 30s. What is it like to readapt to a life, where you spent half of it medicated? What's it like coming out the other side of that?
It's very confusing. I just felt so fully unprepared. And kind of going back to what we were just talking about, the 2-year thing, you've got all these different factors that are kind of interacting with each other, both logical, emotional, spiritual, chemical, practical, professional, all that's happening all at once. But for me, what was also very confusing about this is that I was a completely different person and I didn't know the new person. And the only frame of reference that I had for an unmedicated person was when I was a child. So everything I knew about being an adult was wrong. And yet I was living a life built for somebody I didn't know anymore and like quite literally didn't recognize. And it's dramatic. Like, at least for me, the person I was medicated and the person I am now are so different that I can't relate to that person too. And I have all the memory loss too. So not only do I feel like I can't remember what that person was or what she felt like, but I just don't have any connection to it. And so when you're rebuilding, there's an instinct to go back. People always want to go back to who they were before because they recognize that. And what they don't understand is that there is absolutely no going back here. It is only moving forward. And what I see with people is that you have to be very, very judicious in pruning the hedges of your life. Like that a lot of what you have created for yourself is not going to work for this new person because you weren't making those decisions in the life you created fully coherent, fully clear, fully sober even. You were making decisions under the influence. So the decisions you made are not necessarily going to line up with who you are now. And that was the most difficult part for me, was looking at everything I'd created, admitting that it was wrong for me, and then having to demolish it, blow it up, and restart when for me, it felt very sudden. And for the people involved, it felt very sudden too, right? Because they had known one person for a really long time. And then it's like, I come to them and it's like, hey, so we can't be business partners anymore. And I need out of this thing we created. And this isn't going to work. Like, I'm leaving, right? And then to do that in every part of my life, like people, friends, my own, even like what I had for dinner. I was literally sitting there sometimes like, what do I like to eat now? Because I used to hate ginger and now I really like it and I'm confused. And so it was just this constant experiment of being like, well, do I like this? And like going to do it and seeing how that felt. Do I like this person? Spending time with them, seeing how that felt. And it just felt so childlike in a way. Like I was 7 years old, basically walking up to people saying, will you be my friend? And trying to figure out if I liked it. Like it was just bizarre. And nobody gets that that's what you're doing. What it looks like from the outside is that you're just creating destruction. And you are in a way, but you're doing it because you have to do that in order to clear the rubble so something new that actually works for you can emerge. And that process is really long and it can require some huge decisions and really heartbreaking decisions for people. This didn't happen to me, but I've gotten more than a couple messages from people who have said like, I'm not attracted to my partner or my husband or my wife anymore now that I'm off the drugs, and I don't know if I want to be with them. And basically, like, is that normal?
Yeah.
And, you know, whether or not it's normal is a little bit irrelevant, but it's an example of something that's monumental, right? That you may not want to actually be with the person you committed to anymore because that's how differently you look at the world. And when that's happening all over your life, it's really, really hard, really hard.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. And I mean, there's this, and that's a really interesting thing with the antidepressants, because there's also this, the opposite happens as well. There's a Facebook, if you want to see a really interesting Facebook page, it's the Marriages Destroyed by SNRI page, where they talk about, you know, there's grieving spouses on there where they're like, you know, this, you know, I've been through a divorce, you know, it was okay. My partner got on these medications and they completely changed. And so you can have the opposite happen. And I mean, I've even had some people tell me, you know, I'm thinking about one gentleman who was on stimulant medication and had become a journalist, and you know, just he thought he was interested in that. He was taking ADHD medication. When he came off, he was like, I don't want this career anymore. Like, I hate doing this type of work, and had to start again, you know, in his late 30s, finding a new career.
It's horrible because you've lost all that time, right? It's a sunk cost at that point, especially if you're, you know, well, I mean, I think anyone can feel like it's the wrong time for them, right? But like, anyone who's sunk a lot of time into a person or a thing or a profession, and then suddenly you're like, oh my God, not only do I not want this, but this isn't going to work for me. Like, it is going to kill me if I don't get out of this. And, but then you're left with like, well, how do I start over and do something completely different at 35, 40, 45, 50, right? And what do I even like? Who's going to hire me? It's just brutal. And that's where I get stuck sometimes in the what ifs, just the idea like, who would I have been if I wasn't medicated? Because I was on a math and engineering track. I had won a math award. I was taking advanced math. I loved building bridges and inventing things. And I was probably more likely to go to an MIT or some sort of technical school to do that kind of work. And then my dad died and I got medicated and it all stopped. It just completely stopped. And I didn't have any push to do that kind of work anymore. And so I went to a liberal arts school and just futzed around for 4 years, graduated with a generic history degree, and then have basically spent 15 years just confused with no motivation, no direction, making choices that were the path of least resistance in my life and career because I didn't have any compass anymore. And then I got off the drugs and all of a sudden I was like, oh wait, I have ambition again. And I feel like doing things. And because I had collected 15 years of not doing, you know, math and engineering, and I was doing other things instead, I think, you know, my life has naturally taken me in a different direction because of that. But I can't help but wonder what would have happened. Like, it just completely changed the direction of what I like to do, who I like to be with, and how I thought of myself.
Let's dig into that, because I think that's so interesting, and it's actually something that, I mean, it is quite an intimate thing to share. But could you speak to the personality of like medicated Brooke compared to unmedicated Brooke? Because it seems like there was like an alien living your life. You know, that's the way you make it sound. You look back and you're just like, who is this person? And then who you like? Tell us about the two different Brookes.
I was frequently compared to Wednesday Addams when I was medicated. I was very morose and sullen, and I was smart, still am smart, like sharp, extremely sarcastic, and just like, I would call myself a realist, right? Like, the glass was not half full or half empty. It was simply two sizes too big, and there was no room for interpretation beyond that. I couldn't see beauty in anything. I couldn't feel gratitude. I couldn't be in any way happy with what I had. And I also wasn't really particularly jealous of what other people had either. It was more just kind of like, I just got dealt a crap set of cards. It is what it is. Just keep trudging through until you drop dead. Like, it was just a very, like, I don't want to be here. I didn't ask to be born. Screw everything and everyone. I'm just going to go zone out in front of the TV. Like, that was just kind of the attitude. There was no life. There was no ambition. There was no creativity at all, which now that I'm unmedicated, like, I can't stop it. It's just constant. All I want to do is paint and create, and wrote a book, and that all came back pretty, not quickly, but it slowly emerged over time. And now, I mean, medicated Brooke would have thought unmedicated Brooke is just insufferable, because I spend time reading philosophy and poetry and viewing the world through a much more interconnected sort of quantum physics way, in which things are beautiful and there's gratitude, and I can read cliche phrases like "be the change you wish to see in the world" and actually understand it, and not think to myself, God, that's so stupid, right? Everything when I was medicated was just like so stupid. Like, if you liked something, what you like building, model planes, that's so stupid. Like, it was just so negative and crappy, even if I didn't say it out loud. And I just see so much more nuance and interconnectedness and opportunity and delight and in the world. I mean, there's so much to do here, and I actually want to do it, and I want to be around to do it, which again was not the personality at all when I was medicated.
Gosh, I don't know what to say after that. I mean, I think that was, what an experience to go through. And honestly, I actually don't see a lot of people really talking about that lived experience of kind of stepping out of that and being a new person and kind of piecing your life back together. I guess a question for you is, what was this like for the people closest to you to kind of to see this change? I mean, how did that play out in your relationships?
I'll answer that in a second, but to your point about people not really talking about it too much, I think it's because we get the definitions a little bit wrong. People think that the opposite of depression is happy, or maybe not depressed, and that's not it. The opposite of depression is curiosity. So in order to get out of a depressed state, you have to lean into curiosity, and you have to wonder. You have to learn to wonder about things, which is really hard to do when you're depressed, right? Because in a depressed state, you don't want to do anything. You don't care about anything. But the way out is that curiosity. And the sign of someone, I think, who's recovered from depression is someone who's deeply curious about life and less attached to the outcome of that curiosity. So I think if we can really understand what the opposite of depression actually is, like, happiness or contentment is the byproduct of curiosity, not the opposite of depression. And so I just think we get that wrong in the semantics and the way we ask people to try and heal, because you don't just get to be content or happy or joyful or any of those wonderful things after you're done taking an antidepressant, or you've decided that you're going to deal with your mental health issues through more holistic, less pharmaceutical ways. You have to actually work for that and learn what's going to help you, and fail a lot and feel a lot worse about yourself than you did before. But that's part of the process of getting out. So for me, realizing that there was, like, figuring out that I still had a curious being in me was my handhold out of this. And it continues to be. And that's how life is so much more interesting to me now. It's because I'm curious about how much there's to do. And like, now it's, why are you interested in building model planes? Tell me about that, right? It's me being curious in that person's expression. That's what makes life richer and therefore more rewarding. But as far as other people's relationships, I don't have a great answer for that, because I've always had a very small circle of friends, definitely more introverted, and I was an only child, so I wasn't that great at playing with others, never played any team sports. And so my life before and after drugs was pretty wildly different. I left the city I grew up in, or not grew up in, I left the city I was living in. So I left New York City, moved to Vancouver, Canada, made a whole new group of friends and relationships with people who never knew me medicated. And very few of my relationships have survived the bridge. Maybe 3 of my close ones, maybe two good girlfriends, and A couple, actually, no, there's more than that. A couple friends from college, maybe like half a dozen. Couple girlfriends from elementary school, a couple folks from college, and then my mom. And so my girlfriends, I feel like I sort of abandoned them for 15 years. And it's really only been in my 30s after being unmedicated that I've basically come crawling back and saying, will you forgive me for being an asshole for so long? And because they're wonderful, they have. And then my mom is really the one who has the most insight to that. And what she would say is just that in withdrawal, she started hearing the life come back in me. She said to me one day, I was on the phone and I was having a meltdown over something pretty early on. And she just said, I'm so glad you're doing this, even though I know it's so hard, because I can hear my kid again. I feel like I haven't, like I've always known you were there, but I haven't heard you. I haven't heard inflection in your voice. I haven't heard you have any ambition and she said, I can hear you in there. And I couldn't see that at the time. And I also don't have any perspective because again, I was a kid when I was medicated, but she could see it. And so she's the one who's really able to comment the most on the difference. And yeah, I think she picked up the phone every time I called in withdrawal. That was everyone needs that, I think, if you're in withdrawal. She was my person.
Brooke, what haven't we discussed, which you think is important to share with the audience?
I think I touched on it with the curiosity angle. It's just, I feel like I was asleep for, it wasn't 30 years, but it sort of felt like it because I was a kid before, right? So like when you're a kid, things are just different. But I feel like I woke up at 30 and then I spent 2 years in withdrawal. And so for the past 6 years, 38 now, I've just been trying to like do everything and experience everything. And in some ways I'm so glad that I want to do that, but I also still feel wildly behind in a lot of ways. And it's very difficult for me to parse out what of this is me, what of this was because of my experience. Romantic relationships, especially, I feel very behind and frustrated just because like I said, I'm 38 now, I'm single. I don't know if I'm even capable of having kids. I don't know how much of that was because of the drugs. And I don't know, it's basically, I had a major relationship for 5 years where I just had to learn how to do it. I had to learn the things most people learn in their 20s with their first major relationship. But my first unmedicated relationship started when I was 31. And then it lasted until I was 36. And I had to learn like 15 years of dealing with other people and relationships in 5 years. And then it didn't work out. So now I kind of feel like, okay, I'm finally ready, I think, to have the right kind of like emotional relationship. I know what I need because I didn't know that before. I know how to respect and treat and nurture what somebody else needs because I didn't know that before. But it's like I'm learning it so late that I feel like whole parts of the tree are just going to be, could be cut off to me, right? Like I don't know if like having a family is in my future, in part because the timing of such may not actually make it work out. And I'm lucky that I have the spiritual framework to be able to say, if that's not my path, it's not my path. And it's because I'm destined to do other things. But then the very human part of me just is mad that choice was made for me when I was 15 by some middle-aged guy I'd met once. And worse, I can't untangle what would have been and what is if I hadn't been medicated, or if I've even gotten off the drugs 5 years earlier. And that's the stuff that really bothers me, where there's not any there's never going to be any closure. There's no resolution. It's just that tension you have to live with. And it just is. And it just feels so out of my control. And yet it was in my control. Nobody was forcing those drugs down my throat every morning. I made that choice every single day. I was just as responsible as the doctor who medicated me and as my mom was for signing off on the medication. Like, I played a huge role in this, and that sucks. I wish I don't like having to take responsibility for that, but I got to take responsibility for that and deal with the consequences. And it's just uncomfortable. And I don't think that that's really talked about very much either.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, you're definitely not alone on this, because personally, just within my circle of friends and people I know in this space, I know a lot of women who have, who are a little bit further on the line. You know, they're mid 40s, and they have lost the opportunity to have children, and the same thing had happened to them. No one had told them that when they got on the drugs in the first place, that it was like, oh, hey, by the way, when you come off this, you can be totally disabled, like, you know, for several years. It could happen right in the middle of your years of like, of, you know, child rearing. Because I mean, a lot of people get on these drugs as adolescents and then in their 20s and maybe the early years of their careers when it's just more stressful. And then when things kind of settle down some, you know, in their 30s, they come off and then they get hit with this. And no one has ever warned about it. And I mean, you can't think of something that is potentially more painful than that. You know, taking, you know, like you said, taking away someone's opportunity to do something like that.
Yeah, which it's like nobody knew what they were doing, right? Nobody knew that. Even, I don't think there was any maliciousness on anybody's part. And I think even now, the majority of the prescriptions that are made and stuff, it's like it's not malicious, but it's just, we have got to get better at thinking long term, and we have got to get less reactive and give things time, especially in the case of trauma. Like, why anyone thought it was reasonable to medicate me after my dad died. Of course I was depressed. I wasn't doing drugs. I wasn't on like getting pregnant, teenage pregnancy. My grades dropped from like an A to a B. I was not a kid who was having a crisis. I was a kid who was a serious dancer. So I shut down and was taught to be stoic. So I was stoic. I was confused. I was in shock. And so I wasn't going to be doing great. And quite frankly, I probably wasn't going to be doing great for longer than the 3 months or whatever before someone threw me in therapy. And then the therapist was like, oh, well, you're depressed. And it's like, great. Now let me take on that personality. I'm so impressionable. And I'm in pain. So let me not have to blame it on myself. Let me have a reason for this. But then nobody tried to undo that. They just let me take it and ran with it.
Well, Brooke, I'm about out of questions, but I think we covered some, you know, we covered some topics that really aren't discussed enough on this channel, and I think you really brought them to life.
Thanks.
In a way that only someone who's truly lived it can. And so thank you so much for coming on and sharing what happened.
Well, and thank you too for all your work and for being willing to put yourself in the line of fire. I'm sure that there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes with what you do that probably isn't particularly pleasant, but I know that this work really matters. So thank you.
Yeah, you're right. You're right with that. Thank you. Yeah. If stories like this resonate with you, be sure to check out my interview with Trudy Slaught, where we explore her journey to waking up to a new life after being on antidepressant and antipsychotic medications for over 20 years. Watch it here.